Good morning. We have 2 remaining bowls of plantain chips. It seems like we were on a roll here, so I won't stop you if you guys get hungry during the message and you need a snack. You need to just come up and grab one. That'll be a lot of fun. Happy Mother's Day to the ladies. Have a fantastic day. Thank you so much for you. And we appreciate you. If you would turn with me in your Bibles to the book of Mark, chapter 2. Our text is going to be in Mark chapter 2 this morning. Mark chapter 2, verses 18 through 22 is where we're going to be. Yes, and the children may be dismissed if there's anyone still here that hasn't been dismissed already. In Mark chapter 2, verse 18, it says, follow along with me. John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting. And they came and said to him, "Why do John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?" And Jesus said to them, "While the bridegroom is with them, the attendants of the bridegroom cannot fast, can they? So, as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. But the days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and they will fast in that day. No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. Otherwise, the patch pulls away from it, the new from the old, and a worse tear results. No one puts new wine in old wineskins. Otherwise, the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is lost in the skins as well. But one puts new wine into fresh wineskins." Now, last week, in verses 13 through 17, we saw Jesus and his disciples eating with tax collectors and sinners at the home of Levi, who went on to be known as Matthew. And Jesus was questioned by the religious leaders for doing this. They basically asked why he would eat with, quote unquote, those people who are so obviously sinful and obviously immoral. Jesus explained to them in reply that it is the sick who needs a doctor, in verse 17. In other words, sinners are who I came to this earth to reach. Of course, I'm going to eat with sinners. That's what I'm here to do. And Pastor Mark went into much more detail on this last week, so go back and check it out if you haven't already. I'm not going to elaborate any further on that. But I mention it now, again, for this reason and this reason only. In our text this morning, we haven't really left this scene. We're still here in a home full of sinful people eating, and the narrative hasn't really advanced beyond this. We're still in this idea of Jesus and his disciples eating with people who were considered to be sinful. And in this text, we see Jesus getting asked another question in continuation from the one that we saw last week. Last week, in verses 13 through 17, Jesus was asked, "Why are you eating with sinners?" But now he's getting asked, "And why are you eating at all, for that matter? Why are you not fasting like all of the other good, moral, and upright people who are religious and who care about God and prioritize God do? Why aren't you fasting like they are?" Now, fasting was a foundational part of the practicing faith of the Jews during that time. In the Old Testament law, fasting was only required on the Day of Atonement. And if you're taking note, you want to jot this down, look in Leviticus chapter 16, look in Leviticus chapter 31, and Numbers chapter 29. All of that talks about the Days of Atonement in there. That was observed once a year. But over time, more fasting practice was integrated into religious culture. By the time of the Jewish exile, the whole nation was fasting 4 times a year. We know that from the book of Zechariah chapter 7 and 8. And by the time that Jesus came on the scene, in the time of our text, it was standard practice for Jews to fast twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. Now, these fasts only lasted about 12 hours. They lasted from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. Then after that was done, they could eat food, but they were still a big deal to the practicing Jewish believer. They were considered by the Jews to be an integral part of practicing their faith. In other words, good Jewish people who took their faith seriously fasted on Monday and on Thursday, in the same way that good Christian people today who take their faith seriously might say that they're in church every Wednesday night and twice on Sunday, no matter what. And the thinking is that if God is really a priority in your life, then you won't skip these things. That's the way that they thought back then. And Jesus speaks of this I forgot to grab my clicker. Jesus speaks of this in Luke chapter 18 in his example of the Pharisee praying, and I quote, "God, I thank you that I am not like other people, swindlers, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week, and I pay tithes of all that I get." Do you see how he's talking about the way that he fasts and he tithes as a huge integral part of the faith that he was practicing? And this is the same kind of thing as believers today who talk about how they're in the church. Every time the doors are open, Wednesday night and twice on Sunday, they say, "I'm making God a priority. I put God first. I don't skip these things like the less zealous do. I don't skip these things like worldly people do." Now, when we understand this dynamic, it helps us to visualize the complete meltdown that people were having over the actions of Jesus and his disciples in our text. The practicing Jews of his day were scandalized by what he was doing here. Not only were they eating with sinners, but they were doing this on Monday or Thursday, basically skipping out on the fast days to do that. In fact, we get the impression from their question that that Jesus and his disciples were never really that great about keeping the Monday and Thursday fast to begin with. Well, all of the other devout Jews who, quote unquote, made God a priority in their lives, kept these fasts religiously. Jesus and his disciples were regularly seen freely eating with all the other sinful people who were blowing off the fast as well. That's kind of what was going on here. And so this was so off-putting to the practicing Jews that even the disciples of John the Baptist joined the Pharisees in questioning this behavior. Even the disciples of John the Baptist were thrown off by this. Did you notice that there? It wasn't just the Pharisees asking this time. It was the disciples of John here. Why are you doing this? Why on earth would you regularly skip out on something so crucial, quote unquote crucial, to our faith? It just didn't make sense to them. Why are we doing it? And Jesus answered their question by going straight to the heart of the issue. And here's the issue. People were short-circuiting because they held misconceptions about God and his kingdom. They held misconceptions about God and his kingdom. They were confused and offended that Jesus was skipping the fast days because there were things that they believed about God which were flat out wrong. There were things that they thought and understood about God that they were incorrect about. They didn't have it right. And their false beliefs were informing their response. With this in mind, a theme that's going to come up over and over again today in this study is that people practice in their daily lives what they believe in their hearts. They practice what they believe. What we believe in here and in here is what we do. And it's important to understand that. The way that the religious Jews responded to Jesus in this text was a function of what they believed about God. They were just being true to their beliefs. And for this reason, we don't really pick up anger in Jesus' response to them. He seems to sympathize with them to a degree. He seems to understand that they were just doing what they'd been taught to be true their entire lives. It's okay. It's all right. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. It's okay. It's okay. Don't be. It's okay. It's all right. It's a wonderful song. We praise and worship in this house. It's quite okay. Thank you. No problem at all. Not a problem. Not a problem. But, just taking a step back here, we don't really pick up anger in Jesus' response, okay? He does seem to sympathize with them to a degree. He seems to understand that they were just doing what they were taught to do their whole lives, and so he isn't really getting angry with them here. He sets out to correct their misconceptions about God. He aims for the root issue because he understands that if he can correct their mistaken beliefs, the correction of the behavior will naturally follow as well. Correct the beliefs and you will correct the behavior. And the same is true for us today. The vast majority of the unproductive and misguided and sinful behavior we get caught up in today is a function of mistaken beliefs. Would you believe me if I told you that? It's a function of what we believe in here and in here that causes us to do the unproductive and unhelpful things that we do in our daily lives. And this is why we can't break free from it by being challenged to do different and by resolving to change alone. Those things are helpful, but if we just get around people that are challenging us to do different, that isn't enough, all right? More often than not, what we're doing is a function of flawed beliefs, and those have to be corrected in order to fix the behavior in the long run. For example, I'm giving an extreme example here, but it fits well, and that is the disease called anorexia. Are you guys familiar with that? I actually have someone in my extended family who struggled with that a long time ago. These people literally starve themselves to death, and they're kind of like a human skeleton sometimes. It's very hard to watch. And the question, of course, is why do they do this? Why do they continue to starve themselves? It's because when they look in the mirror, they see someone who's overweight. They see something that's untrue. They see a misconception of themselves as untrue, but it's true to them. They believe it, and so it drives them to destroy themselves. And family and friends look on in horror and beg them to eat, and they can't get them to stop starving themselves. Nonetheless, no matter how much they encourage them, no matter how much they work with them, they just can't get it to stop. Now, the only way to change this destructive behavior, again, is to correct the false belief and encourage, but you have to correct the belief for the behavior to change. And with this in mind, the Jews in Jesus' day had misconceptions about God. They had false beliefs about his kingdom that were driving unproductive behavior. And in this text, we see Jesus correcting these false beliefs. He did so with 3 parables. Note that the 2 latter parables are correcting, they're both devoted to one misconception here, so we'll look at them together. But we're looking at 2 misconceptions that Jesus is correcting here. The first misconception that practicing Jews had of that day was that God is austere. God is austere. And by austere, we mean that God is rigid and puritanical. He takes no pleasure in enjoyment, entertainment, or indulgence, and that he's delighted most by our acts of self-denying duty and religious devotion. Again, this is the way the practicing Jews of that day tended to think about God. And for this reason, they believed that you drew close to God by denying what you enjoyed and replacing it with somber acts of religious devotion, like prayer or fasting. And on the flip side, they generally felt that God was not in what was fun or indulgent in any way. In other words, you had to distance yourself from what you enjoyed in order to encounter God in general. That's the way that they thought. My question to you is does this sound familiar at all to you in the present day? Was this baked into your Christian experience at all through your upbringing or through your experience with the church overall? I can share with you, in my case, that it was. And of course it was with the best of intentions in the world, but it was there. And these are kind of lame examples, but I give them anyway just to help you understand how this works. But growing up, I used to hate it. I'm confessing now, okay? This is confession time. I used to absolutely hate it when Christmas was on Sunday. Hated it. Why? Because when it was on Sunday, we were never allowed to open our presents until after church. It was so difficult for me. You don't understand, the struggle was so real. And I can remember one Christmas Sunday in particular when I was a kid. My sister and I woke up and we saw, in addition to the presents under the tree, we saw 2 huge boxes sitting on the couch. One for me and one for my sister. And we were looking at these boxes. We'd never seen anything like this before. It was so big it couldn't even fit with the other presents. And we're like, what are these things? We were going absolutely nuts. We're dying to open these things. We've got to have this. And we're like, let us open the presents. You know what my parents said? Nope. Presents have to wait. Today is Sunday. Christmas is about Jesus. We honor God first, and then we open presents. So get ready for church. Now, many of you have had the same experience. It's fine. That was a consistent thing for me. Another time I can recall turning on the TV one evening and being delighted to find an episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation that I had really been wanting to see. Yes, I watched Star Trek when I was a kid. I was nerdy then and I am now. But this is back in the days before Netflix and Hulu and Amazon Prime and all of those things. Back then, in those ancient days, I tell my children about these days all the time, because to me, or to them, I'm old, okay? And back then, way back then, you had to watch the show that you wanted to watch at the time it was aired on the right channel, and you had to watch what they were putting on with commercials, right? You didn't get to pick and choose or to skip past. And so when I turned on the TV, and there it was, the episode that I wanted to see, it was like I hit the jackpot. Yes, finally, I've been wanting to see this one forever. Yes! And no sooner did I get the words yes out of my mouth than my father called and says, "Kids, come out to the living room. It's time to do devotions." No! And I went out and told, "Dad, you don't understand. You don't understand. I've been wanting to see this episode forever." My dad said, "Well, you can go back and watch it after we're done with devotions, but it's going to be over by then." Well, we honor God first. Turn the TV off. Time for devotions, all right? And many of you have had similar experiences, made similar choices. I'm not trying to poo-poo on this. I totally get the intentions were good. I totally understand what they were trying to do. But, no sports on Sunday. You can't be part of that sports team because it requires you to play on Sunday. We honor God in this house. We put God first. Now, I realize, again, that these things are done with the best of intentions, and I understand that the goal was designed to instill values that prioritize God in everything, which is wonderful. We need to do that. However, I wonder if we were instilling another idea about God in people's minds at the same time that might not be helpful, that we need to watch out for. Every time that we say, "Stop doing that thing that you enjoy so we can prioritize God in our lives," is it possible that we can communicate the idea that fun and God don't mix? Do you follow me? Fun and God, they don't go together. Those things don't mix. They don't go together. They don't go together. We're communicating the idea that you can't honor God and do what you enjoy at the same time. It's possible that it can happen. Now, some of you might argue, "Well, I enjoy worshiping God." And if you do, that's great. It's wonderful. But over the years of pastoring, I've come across plenty of people who go on and on about how much they love worshiping God and being in His house on Sunday. But at the same time, they've gotten pretty ticked off at me when the sermon went late. And they were mad that it was going late, and they were out the door when they were leaving. So I don't always buy it, personally. For me personally, and I know that this isn't for everybody, but for me what happened was that worship was the opposite of enjoyment. It was a laborious burden. And this was because I developed the belief personally that God was austere, and that the only way to draw close to Him was to set aside what I enjoyed. That was the experience. I like this, I have to stop doing this in order to draw close to God. I like this, I have to stop doing this in order to draw close to God. And this is how the Jews of that day understood God. It's not true, but that's the way that they understood it. And this is why they piled on more and more religious duties to their routine of worship. And this is why they were totally put off when Jesus skipped all of these religious duties to go to a party. They were put off by it. When they finally asked Jesus why He did this, He explained that they had a complete misconception of God. He isn't austere. On the contrary, He's a lot of fun, actually. God's a lot of fun. In other words, the true and living God brings celebration into our lives when we're with Him, not duty and obligation. When we're close to God, when we're with Him, He brings celebration into our lives, not duty and obligation. And He illustrated this with a parable. He's clearly illustrating this with a parable. Follow along in verses 19 and 20 of the text. "Well, the groom is with them. The attendants of the groom cannot fast, can they? As long as they have the groom with them, they cannot fast. But the days will come when the groom is taken away from them, and they will, on that day, fast." And Jesus' point here was that it was completely out of step to fast in the presence of Jesus, in the same manner that it was out of step to mourn at a wedding. That's basically what He was saying there. Being close to Jesus brings celebration. It's supposed to be as fun and as joyous and as indulgent as a wedding. When you're with Jesus, it's normal to eat and to drink and to be merry. It's when you're separated from Jesus that the mourning and fasting becomes appropriate. And the Jews' misconception of God was causing them to behave like they were at a funeral when in fact they were actually at a wedding. Now, note that Jesus doesn't put down mourning and fasting in general. He doesn't say that acts of somber sacrifice and devotion are bad. What He's saying is that these aren't part of being close to God. What He's saying is that these are the things that you do when you feel distance from Him through sin or some other difficult circumstances. When you're separated from Him, this is the appropriate thing to do. But when you're close to Him, celebration is the appropriate thing to do. So when you truly know God, drawing close to Him is an act of celebration. And it will feel normal to you to dance and to sing and to laugh and to indulge yourself as you would at the best of parties. And when you think about it, even at weddings, Some otherwise reserved people have been known to be found on the dance floor, doing the chicken dance and doing the Macarena, and laughing and having a great time while they make a fool of themselves. And the point is that even reserved people by nature can let loose in the right environment of celebration. We've seen it happen. Some of us have done it ourselves and been caught on film. And if you want to share any of that, please let me know. But you get the idea there. Those who truly know God celebrate when they're with Him. Being close to Him, being with Him, being in His presence is a cause for celebration. If you're mourning, you've missed the point, is what he's trying to say here. And I'm going to give you a chapter with a couple of verses. We're not going to turn there, but if you want to jot these down and check them out later. In 2 Samuel 6, we see the Ark of the Covenant entering Jerusalem, which was very much the Old Testament equivalent of God drawing near to God's people. You follow me? This was the presence of God entering the city. This was a huge deal. This was God drawing close to His people. And in the midst of that scene, in verse 14, it says that David danced before the Lord with all of his might. You guys familiar with that account? He danced before the Lord with all of his might. Now, on the other hand, in this same scene and account, we have Michal, David's wife, who was watching while David leaped and danced before the Lord. And you know what she did? She despised it. She despised him. It looked horrible to her. To her, David looked like a fool. And the point here is that those who mistake God as austere completely miss God's presence when He's with them, and they even criticize the saints when they're celebrating. It was happening in the Old Testament, it's happening with Jesus in the New Testament, and it happens still today. Those who really know God, those who really understand Him, celebrate when they're with Him. And those who have a mistaken impression of Him as austere, they are put off by the people celebrating, and they criticize it, and they miss God's presence. And so remember, God is fun. Being with Him brings a celebration. And those who suggest otherwise, they're mistaken. They're well-meaning, but they're mistaken about this. And that's what Jesus was saying in the parable. Now, the second misconception the practicing Jews of that day had was that God is traditional. By traditional, we mean that God is a God of established institutions. He is against what's new and different and outside of the norm. Thus, we draw close to God by sticking to what we've always done and avoiding what doesn't fit the mold. That's kind of the idea that's there. Now, the fast days were established religious tradition for as long as anyone could remember. So the Jews really choked when Jesus skipped them. In their minds, God's sanction was connected to these traditions. So skipping the fast was a big red flag to them. And they asked Jesus why He would do such a thing. Why would you do that? It doesn't make any sense. Again, Jesus' response was that they had a misconception about God. God is not traditional. On the contrary, He is unconventional. In other words, you don't really find God moving in established tradition. You find Him moving where those traditions are being broken, actually. That's where you tend to see Him moving. And Jesus drives home this point with two parables that say the same thing in verses 21 and 22. In verse 21, He says, "No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. Otherwise, the patch pulls away from it, the new from the old, and a worse tear results." And in verse 22, He says, "No one puts new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise, the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is lost, and the skins as well. But one puts new wine into fresh wineskins." The point of both of these parables is the same. The advancement of God's kingdom in the world is incompatible with established traditions. Again, the advancement of God's kingdom in this world is incompatible with established traditions. Now, before we go any further, I need to address an objection that is most likely forming in some of your minds as I say this. There are some of you who've studied this chapter, who study the Bible a lot in general, who have studied this passage before, perhaps read some studies or heard some sermons on it, and you've probably heard that the old cloth and the old wineskins refers to the Old Covenant or the Old Testament system, and the new cloth and the new wineskins refers to the New Covenant or the New Testament system. I would encourage you to I would suggest otherwise. I think that translation or that approach is problematic for two main reasons, okay? I'm not going to put these on the board, but just jot them down. First, the Old Testament is not incompatible with the New Testament. Can I say that? You guys understand what I'm saying here? The Old Testament is not incompatible with the New Testament. The Bible is clear throughout that the New Testament is a fulfillment of the Old Testament. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said that he did not come to abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill the law and the prophets. On the road to Emmaus, Jesus said to the two men that were with him on the road, he spoke from the Old Testament scriptures, the law and the prophets, and he showed how those testified of him entirety. So the Old Testament is not incompatible with the New Testament. Both of these parables in our text speak of the complete incompatibility between something old and something new. And so that alone tells us that it couldn't be the Old and the New Testament because they're not incompatible. They're not incompatible at all. Also, the second reason is that the fast days, Monday and Thursday, which were the subject of this whole controversy to begin with in our text, these weren't biblical law. These weren't Old Testament prescribed things. They were man-made tradition. That's what they were. They weren't prescribed in the scriptures. We kind of talked about that before. Thus, Jesus' reference to the inflexible old cloth and the inflexible old wineskins was a reference to an inflexible tradition, not the scripture itself, right? So Jesus' parables are clearly teaching that God's kingdom work in this world is incompatible with established tradition. It tends to buck the system. In general, the movement of God in this world will be found in places where these established norms and practices are being broken. Jesus was saying that God is not a God of tradition. He is unconventional. With this in mind, there's something to think about as we process this. How are you with change? How do you handle change? How do you handle it when you encounter things that are new and different in the world around you? Do you view change as an opportunity to embrace? Or do you view it as a threat to resist? Something that we need to consider as evangelicals. I'm assuming that all of us here are evangelicals. If you're not, I apologize for painting with too broad of a brush, but it's something that we evangelicals need to consider, is that we don't have a great track record on handling change. We don't. Many of us have heard of stories within the church itself where a change to the color of the carpet or a change to the color of the wall is enough to spark a huge controversy. We just don't handle stuff like even that well. And then if you translate that out to society, when there's changes in society, that can send us into full-blown meltdown. And this is a real problem. Why? Because God moves through change. He always did. He still does. And those who mistake God as traditional, they're the ones that fight against change to preserve the old ways. That's a problem. The Apostle Paul is the classic example of that. Someone who was a fierce persecutor of the church, who stood in the way trying to stop what God was doing. And this is how he describes what he was doing, right here on the board. I seem to have pushed the button already. This is how he described what he was doing in the book of Galatians 1. I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries among my countrymen, being extremely zealous for my ancestral traditions. In the previous verse, in verse 13, he talks about the way that he persecuted in the church. And here he says he was being zealous for the traditions of his fathers, for his ancestral traditions. Very important to realize. He was fighting to preserve the traditions of his fathers, which he felt were being threatened by the church. Now, on the other hand, those who know God, understand him to be unconventional, they can recognize and embrace change when God breaks the mold, and he breaks the mold all the time. You just read the New Testament, you see he was breaking the mold. But an early example of that in the church is with Peter, when he saw the vision of the sheet and was called to the house of Cornelius and preached the gospel to the household. And they were Gentiles, and they were saved as they were without becoming Jews. And it was something totally different than they'd ever seen before. And Peter struggled with it, and the early church struggled with it, but at the end of the day, they were able to embrace it because they understood that God was doing new things, and he was a God who did fresh and new things and changed things. And so God is not traditional. And if we see him that way, we will work against it. We have to be careful. So, in conclusion, in order to follow God, we must correct our misconceptions about him. Because what we believe about him affects the way that we practice our faith. The way that we understand him, our faith, affects our practice. So how do you understand him? Do you understand him as austere? Or do you understand him as celebratory and fun? Do you understand him as traditional? Or do you understand him as unconventional? there are other ways that we understand him as well that can affect the way that we practice our faith. And also, we can think about the way that he sees us. The way that we understand him seeing us has an effect. Do you believe that God sees you as a valued child that he loves because you are one of his children? Or does he see you as some kind of a flawed servant and you're constantly trying to prove that you're valuable to him through your works and through your efforts? It has a huge effect upon the way that you practice your faith. What we believe affects what we practice. And so my prayer is that we would continue to grow in our knowledge of God, to understand him for who he is and accept him as he is so that we can live out and represent him well in this world. And would you pray with me at this time? Heavenly Father, we thank you for the day and we thank you for the occasion to come and to study your word. And we thank you for the example that you've set. And we thank you for who you are. Because when we know you and embrace you for who you are, it's a truly wonderful and revolutionary and life-changing experience. Lord, you are not of this world. You're nothing like this world. You're totally different, and you bring better things in every way. And I pray that you'd help us to understand you for who you are and help us to emulate you. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.